Hi everyone, my name is Allegra and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to go over my May wrap-up. In the month of May, I read 7 books, which means I am absolutely blowing through my original goal for 2021, which was 40 books. I do plan on updating that. It's very possible now that my state has opened up and I am able to do a few more social things because I'm part of the Max Vax crowd, that my reading will slow down. But I've noticed that the more social I am, the less that I'm finding myself like escaping through YouTube, escaping through doom scrolling, and I'm choosing books over that, which means I'm actually reading more. But regardless, I read 7 books. I'm really excited to get into it, so let's get started. The first book that I finished in May was No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. This is an experimental book. It is actually what I believe is called autofictive. Autofictive means that this is something that did happen to the author. This book is rooted in reality. However, it is a very experimental type of book, so I wouldn't call it a straight memoir. And there's absolutely parts of it that are fictionalized. The gist is this book is in 2 parts, and in the first part it is written very much like a Twitter stream. Not exactly like you're not seeing all the timestamps or the @ handles, those types of things, but it's done in short, punchy sentences. The paragraphs are very short. It does kind of tell a linear story, but there's a lot of interjections of like inside jokes almost if you're someone who is terminally online. And I will say I got most of the inside jokes, which was a little bit eye-opening. But it's kind of written to follow this trajectory of the narrator who is never named, who becomes viral on the internet, and that kind of becomes her job. There's also some information in this first half about her family and some excitement that's going to be happening in their family. All of this promptly collapses in part 2. While the style stays very similar, it is way more narrow in focus, and it focuses specifically on a family tragedy that the author and her extended family is going through. This particular tragedy did happen to the author's family, specifically her sister, and that's where that autofictive part comes in. It is autobiographical, and everything that matters in this book did actually happen to the author. There are certain details that have been changed, particularly in the first half, just to make it flow a little better, I think, as a story. The second half of the book is still written in that punchy style, although it's a bit longer in paragraph form, but it's still written very much in that experimental, almost Twitter-esque style, but with a shift on what is actually important in life. That sounds really corny. It's not corny. It was done really well. It made me cry. I gave this book 5 stars. One of the things that this book actually did for me was made me realize how online I am and how much I'm missing in my life because of that. 2020 and the first part of 2021, like clearly that was something that was almost needed for that connection, but I needed to recognize how I was ignoring the things I could do outside of my online sphere, and certain things that I normally wouldn't have thought were so important to know about all the time were really taking over my life. So for that reason, and because the style of this book really grabbed my attention, this got 5 stars from me. Some other reviewers have said it feels disjointed because part 1 and part 2 almost feel like different books. I think that was intentional, and I think it was done in a way that is really perfect for the story that the author was trying to tell. So yeah, 5 out of 5 stars. Highly recommend this book. I read it, I think, in 2 days. The next book that I read was Una Out of Order by Marguerita Montmore. This is a speculative contemporary-ish fiction about a young woman named Una who, on the day of her 19th birthday, finds out that she actually jumped through time for her entire adult life. So on New Year's Day in 1983, instead of it being 1983, she wakes up in 2015 in her 50-plus old body. And she learns from her mother and her assistant Kenzie that she is going to live the rest of her adult life this way. And she has written has written herself a letter to kind of explain what to expect in that coming year, because 2014 Una actually already lived 2015 Una's life. And it then follows her experiences for the next 7 years, which are completely out of order, as the title suggests. I ended up giving this 2 stars. I think that this premise was really, really interesting, and there could have been a lot done with it as far as like exploring what it means to be at different stages in your life and how not knowing things can impact your future for that particular time frame. But I also didn't find it executed very well. Una was an unlikable character, and I don't think she was supposed to be. I absolutely can handle unlikable characters. I think Esun in the Broken Earth series is an unlikable character, and she's probably one of my favorite characters in the last 5 to 10 years that I've read. And Una just fell flat for me. She didn't listen to herself when she wrote letters, which makes me wonder why she would even try to change that. The author doesn't really explore whether or not the future can be changed. I guess Una points out in some of the letters to her future self that she also doesn't know, but she thought she would try. But overall, it just fell flat for me. I feel like a lot of these speculative fiction ideas sound really interesting and are extremely hard to pull off. And that's not a rag on the authors that kind of fall flat for me when they have these really interesting concepts, because it's a super difficult thing to make into an entire cohesive story. So ultimately, 2 out of 5 stars, maybe 1.5, not something that I could recommend in good faith. The next book that I finished in May was Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, and this has been getting a lot of buzz lately, and for good reason. It is the story of 2 women, one a cis woman named Katrina, and one a trans woman named Reese, and the connection to these 2 women would be Ames, who was a trans woman and then detransitioned. When he was a trans woman, he went by the name Amy, and he and Reese used to date before Ames's detransition. And then he hooked up with Katrina, who is also his boss, and Katrina becomes pregnant. So this is a character study. Going into this, I thought it was going to focus a lot more on that concept of like a non-traditional family where these 3 people come together to raise a baby. The reason that is posited why these 3 people should come together to raise this baby is while Ames has detransitioned, he is not comfortable with considering himself in the role of father, while he is comfortable with the concept of him in the role of parent. And when he and Reese were together, all Reese really wanted was to have a baby, and she can't physically carry a child, so Ames is trying to come up with a way to make this all work. I thought this book was going to be more about navigating what that looks like and a non-traditional family structure. And while there is some conversation about what that might look like, this is more of a focus on Ames and Reese's prior relationship, as well as, since it's literary fiction, getting more deep into the concept of what it means to be trans, what it means to detransition, which is a story that I don't feel we hear very much about unless it's kind of framed in a really turf stance, and in this book it's not. So if anyone has concerns about that, it does that in a really sensitive way. It's not something I necessarily completely understand, which is why I want more books that include it, and I really liked the way that was approached. Some other reviewers did note that it feels like Tori Peters kind of like goes off on a tear and gets really lost in the language that she's using. I kind of liked that, although I completely understand what they mean. There were parts where you were like, wait, weren't we just talking about this aspect of the book? And then it goes into these really in-depth stories that, while there's a relationship to what was happening there, it feels like it could have been integrated a little differently. And some of the language is a bit flowery, a bit florid, but I still really enjoyed this. All of these characters are relatively unlikable, and I think that's actually a really important thing to cover. They're super flawed. There's a lot of focus on Reese and her examination of her role in relationships, whether that's with cis men or with other trans women, what that looks like for her and what femininity means to her, and kind of navigating those things. There's also a lot of discussion with Reese and his detransition, why he chose to do that, and his early transition when he was younger. And I find those really fascinating pieces. There's a lot of different conversations about like being newly out, what it means to be a parent or a mother in the queer community. There is some criticism in this book that it touches on white queer experiences. That actually does get brought up in the book as a concern, and I appreciated that. I also believe that Tori Peters herself is white, so it makes sense that that's where the narrative focuses. But I really did appreciate that all of these characters were allowed to be flawed, and all of these characters weren't upheld as some kind of beacon of queerness or how transness should be. There's a lot of conversations in there about the flaws of like larger structures and how that would impact a trans person's experience with gender and with relationships. I don't know, I just really liked this. I think I would have really appreciated seeing more of the found family, non-traditional family with the baby, but it kind of ends open-ended. Overall, I gave this 4 stars. I really do wish that there had been a better ending. And I don't mean like a happier ending. It just didn't feel, it felt a little bit like a cop-out of an ending, which I find is true in a lot of literary fiction that I read. Moving right along, the next book that I read in May was The Push by Ashley Audrain. This follows the story of a woman who, it's actually her writing a letter to her ex-husband to explain why she acted the way she did. That's how the book starts. And this follows the same kind of plot as Baby Teeth or We Need to Talk About Kevin, that kind of bad seed storyline. And it's from the mother's perspective. Much of it is in second person. I apparently in the last few years have decided I want to read a lot of second person narrative books because it's framed as the main character Blythe writing to her ex-husband to explain why she had suspicions about their oldest child. There are also parts of the book that include information about Blythe's mother and grandmother to kind of explain why Blythe might be having these emotions and these concerns. And she also kind of questions her own sanity. Was it postpartum depression? So after she had her first child, Violet, she couldn't feel connected to her. She felt like there was something wrong literally from the moment she was born, well into when they had their second child. And some more tragedies strike. I'm not going to get into details because I don't want to spoil anything, but Blythe kind of like descends into a type of madness, a type of paranoia, and some of it is justified. It turns out that her husband is useless and doesn't listen to her and is a horrible person. And you can see that from the beginning if you look at it through not Blythe's eyes. You can see all of the warning signs when she's talking about how happy they were early on. I did really appreciate how this didn't have an open ending. Ultimately, you are told whether or not Blythe was reliable in her suspicions, and I don't want to get into who was right and who was wrong. There are a lot of gray characters in this. I feel like the chapters about her mother and grandmother were really helpful to kind of frame the story, as well as put in that doubt of whether or not this is generational trauma and it's something that is actually all in Blythe's head, or if it's something that she truly should be concerned about. But they did drag the story a little bit because they were in such a different format. I wonder if the entire book had been written in third person as opposed to Blythe's being in second person as a note to her husband. And Blythe does a lot of really sketchy shit. She definitely is not a perfect person. There's a lot of gray area in how she reacts, regardless of what the ultimate outcome, whether or not she's right about her daughter Violet, or she is suffering from the effects of generational trauma and perhaps postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. It does end in a way that answers the questions. Whether or not that part of Blythe's narrative is reliable, I'm not going to give it away, but I think this would be a great summer read if anyone's looking for a domestic thriller. Next up, I read The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This was not a library book, so I actually have the physical copy here. And initially when I picked this up, I thought it was going to be sci-fi for some reason. I don't know why I got that in my head, but this is, again, literary fiction. It's not sci-fi. There is some speculative fiction aspect of the Office of Historical Corrections because it talks about a governmental office that doesn't actually exist, but it's not like your far-flung sci-fi speculative fiction stuff. Overall, I gave this book 3.5 stars. However, there are 2 short stories in here that I just found to be outstanding and made this book absolutely worth purchasing. The first one is called Richard of York Gave Battle in Vain, and it is the story of a young woman who poses just kind of offhand in a bathing suit that is the Confederate flag, and the repercussions that come from that when she is confronted about the history of that and what that means, and she starts to double down on her behavior. It was just a really well done and really tightly done way of explaining how doubling down on behavior hurts not only those around you, but also yourself, and also why someone might choose to do that. It was one of those stories that had me putting the book down and taking a deep breath, even though it wasn't that long. And the other story that got 5 stars for me is called Why Won't Women Just Say What They Want? And that is clearly inspired by the Me Too movement, and it's about all of these women who were apologized to by a man who basically harassed them, coerced them, those types of things, and what those apologies mean to those women and how they react to that. I really appreciated this because there's been so much conversation about, oh, how do we handle abusers in our communities? What do we do about the Me Too movement or the Time's Up movement? Like, how do we approach this? Should people even apologize? Because maybe that person that they hurt doesn't really remember it. Who are they apologizing for? Are they looking for redemption, or are they actually trying to make amends? And it was done really beautifully and from a whole bunch of different perspectives. I think it was absolutely the breakout story in this collection. A few of the other stories didn't quite resonate with me. I don't think that they were poorly written. I just don't think that they were meant for me. But overall, just those 2 made this absolutely worth purchasing. I said I read 7 books at the beginning of the video, but I can't count. I actually read 6. And the next book that I read, and the last book that I read in May, was All's Well by Mona Awad. I was given this as an ARC from NetGalley, which I really appreciate, and in exchange for my honest review. So Mona Awad wrote Bunny, which is one of my favorite books that I read in 2020, and All's Well kind of follows a similar vein. It's not the same story, it's not the same place, but there's a lot of overlap. Just like in Bunny, this is set in a small liberal arts college on the East Coast, and it does follow kind of the pretentiousness that can happen in different arts communities. In Bunny, it was fiction writing and creative fiction, and in All's Well, it is theater. And there are a lot of theater allusions, specifically Shakespeare, in this. I feel that if I were more into Shakespeare, I would have gotten more of the jokes. I connected a little more with Bunny just because I have experienced like the creative writing aspect of things more than I've experienced theater, at least post high school. Regardless, this book was really good. It was definitely on par with Bunny. I think that Mona Awad is kind of the master at taking a mundane thing and then amping it up into like almost a frenetic pace, and then at the end making you question your own reality without feeling like she's not trying to actually wrap the story up, which I think is a really hard thing to do. The plot of the story is Miranda Fitch is a theater professor at this small school, it's never named, and she's suffering from chronic pain as the result of falling off the stage when she was at the height of her own acting career, and how she's kind of faltering and failing because of that. She is getting ready to start the spring semester with her theater students, and she wants to put on the stage play All's Well That Ends Well, which is one of Shakespeare's problem plays, I guess. Again, not super familiar with those. I've really only read a few of Shakespeare's plays. And the students that she's with really don't want to do it. They want to do Macbeth. And then she mysteriously meets these 3 brothers, and her pain starts to go away. And it ramps up from there, it ramps up from there. There are absolutely allusions to Macbeth throughout Miranda's experience. The frenetic pacing gets so intense at the end. Like, I wanted to put it down because I had things to do, but I felt like if I did, like the book was going to run off without me. It is extremely surreal. It is darkly funny. I do think it falls a little more flat than Bunny. Again, that could just be my familiarity with Shakespeare. There were also a couple things I thought might be symbolic, but I could just be trying too hard to read into them. For example, Miranda has 3 different physical therapists or doctors, and their names are Mark, Luke, and John, but there's no Matthew, so maybe I'm just looking too deeply into that. But it was overall a really good showing from Mona Awad. If she continues on this path, she's going to become a must-buy author by me. I still preferred Bunny, but this was absolutely worth my time, and if you liked Bunny, I highly recommend All's Well. And that's my reading wrap up for May. I'm actually looking forward to June. I've got some projects in mind, and I will hopefully see you later. Bye!